between how we think about ourselves now, the laid back, lucky country, and then actually what Australia looks like in reality. And in reality, we're not laid back. We're the second highest user of antidepressants in the OECD. You know, we're not irreverent. Comedy is now more on the Hannah Gadsby side of things than on the Barry Humphries side of things. You know, we're not anti-authoritarian. If you looked at COVID, we were the most happy country to go along with this sort of awful authoritarian regime. And so there is this cognitive dissonance in Australia, and what it means is I think we're a country where at the moment we don't really know who we are anymore.
Welcome to the New Flesh podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Jonathan Astro, and with me is Ricky Allpark. Ricky, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Yes, very good, Ricky. I tell you what, I've been thinking, I don't want to sit around and just talk to you. All you do is like, you know, I know what you think and you do a podcast. So I thought, why don't I talk to someone else who has a podcast? So that's, you know, I mean, are you into that or?
Well, I am a fan of podcasts. I do run my own, but I also listen to a lot of podcasts. So yeah, I'm pretty into it.
Yeah, good. Correct answer.
Well, we always tell you the truth here on the New Flesh podcast, and the truth is that we need your help. We need you to leave us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show. We read all of the reviews, by the way. We're also on YouTube, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment about the show. And please tell your friends about the show. If they don't like what they hear, are they really your friends?
It's in the words of the Donald, I would call them stone cold losers.
Excellent. Well, with that in mind, on with the show. Will Kingston is the host of Australiana, the flagship podcast from the Spectator Australia that covers Australian politics and culture. Will also has a day job, which we'll ask him about in a moment. Will, welcome to the New Flesh.
G'day guys, good to be here.
Now, it was my task today to write your bio, and I read your LinkedIn profile, but I could only make sense of the podcast bit. Will, what on earth is an experienced activist?
Yeah, I can only make sense of the podcast bit as well, don't worry. It's a fancy way of saying management consultant, basically. And it's an interesting journey to how I got from management consulting to management consulting with a side of podcasting. But I think, you know, for the audience here, they're probably less interested in kind of, you know, my kind of business career as more how my business career influenced why I wanted to start having these conversations. And I remember probably the first thing kind of that came into my mind. I remember I was working at PwC when the marriage equality vote, the Gay Marriage Act was kind of plebiscite, I should say, was all going through. And I remember the lunch and learn sessions, which were basically propaganda, telling people to support it. I remember when it went through that on every floor there was champagne being popped. And look, I voted for in support of gay marriage. I'm you know, pretty classic libertarian, you know, do what you want to do basically. But I just thought there was something a bit off about how kind of there were corporations that were forcing kind of a particular ideology onto their employees. And it's something I've thought more and more about. I think it's something which is really obvious in the voice debate. And it goes to this wider, I guess, culture at the moment where there are particular institutions that are telling you how to think and what to say. And if you don't, I guess, abide by those particular talking points, you can be shamed, you can be cancelled. And this feeling of frustration just kept building and building. And I said, oh, look, I've got to try and get it out somehow. And the microphone seemed like as good an option as any way to try and vent that frustration and to try and say those uncomfortable truths that just aren't being said as much as they should be.
And does your day job provide some sort of cover for your work as a political podcaster? Because I ask this because if you were working in any sort of creative field or if you had a job in HR, your podcast would at best get you shunned from the lunchroom and at worst it could get you fired.
Yeah, so I work for an American company and I spend probably most of my time now in the US. And that is the shield because most people in the US aren't particularly invested in whether or not Australia has, you know, has a voice as part of their constitution. But it's something I've thought a lot about. And the short answer is if I was still working for PwC, let's say that, I would be quite worried. I would be quite worried. And this is something the podcast has been going for a few months, so it's still early days.
But it's enough. You've done enough. Like it's early days, but the guest list is enough to that'd be it. Like if you just rolled into PwC, I mean, how do you think that would manifest if you did work at a place like that and you just did 2 months and you were talking to Posey Parker, Sydney Watson, all these people, and you just were turning up at your desk and not talking about it? But how do you think that would go?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It could very well manifest that a nosy kind of HR manager who's read a bit too much Foucault says that this is, that words are violence and that Will is promoting violent talking points. Now, I'm a big believer that even if that was the case, I don't believe it is. Even if that is the case, it's better to get those conversations out in the open and to hear those sorts of things. And that's how you actually is the best way to address those problems. That sort of nuance actually doesn't work particularly well in corporate Australia at the moment. So it's a really interesting question. I don't know is the answer, but I've got to the point, something has snapped in me where I go, you know what, I just don't give a shit anymore. I'm just going to say the things that I believe. And if, I was to get fired down the line or if future job opportunities down the line were to come at that cost, it is now, probably for the first time in my life, a cost I'm willing to bear.
Well, let's talk about your podcast, Australiana, for the Spectator. How did the project start and what's your vision for it?
I wrote an article for the Spectator Australia a couple of years ago during COVID. Everyone was baking sourdough bread and trying to do handstands, and I thought, I might try and do a bit of writing. And the article was the death of the Aussie larrikin, which I think kind of Barry Humphries' death recently put that into sharp focus once again. The angle that I took on it was not just that those classic Aussie values of larrikinism, anti-authoritarianism, irreverence, all that sort of stuff. It's not just that they're fading away, it's that they're fading away, but Australians just don't seem to notice. I think kind of if you actually spoke to Australians, they'd still associate those values with themselves. And so it's almost this cognitive dissonance. There is this gap between how we think about ourselves now, the laid back, lucky country, and then actually what Australia looks like in reality. And in reality, we're not laid back. We're the second highest user of antidepressants in the OECD. We're not irreverent. Comedy is now more on the Hannah Gadsby side of things than on the Barry Humphries side of things. We're not anti-authoritarian. If you looked at COVID, we were the most happy country to go along with this sort of awful authoritarian regime. And so there is this cognitive dissonance in Australia, and what it means is I think we're a country where at the moment we don't really know who we are anymore. And then that kind of got me thinking, well, I'd like to start having conversations that perhaps indirectly start to shed a bit of a light on who we are as a country today. In order to do that, we're speaking to Australians, but we're also speaking to a lot of Brits and Americans because I think our culture is downstream of American and British culture. And I took this idea to Rowan Dean because I think the Spectator Australia is a really good brand that aligns with those sorts of conversations, and that traditionally it has been irreverent. It has been unafraid to say some of the things that other people or other institutions are afraid to say. And it's got a great kind of heritage and history. It's the oldest surviving weekly magazine in the world. So, and it's the oldest surviving weekly magazine in the world, which I think they recognise. Print media is only going in one direction, and they need these sorts of mediums to keep their messaging current. In terms of the vision, keep building it out and seeing what happens. Like I'm this is a passion for me. It's not a business at this stage. So for me, it's just every week trying to find someone interesting to have a chat with, and if that leads somewhere, you beauty. But I'm not saying that we're going to be the next trigonometry at this point. But it's just about having fun chats with people and trying to again shine a bit of a light on where we're at as a country.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about our loss of identity, I guess. We've spoken to a number of guests from the US and from the UK who have this idea, that still have this larrikin idea of Australia, and they're shocked when we tell them that things are going woke just as they are in the US and in the UK. And so, yeah, I guess that brand overseas is still there, but here very much there is a sense of the death of larrikinism. And maybe we could get your thoughts on the passing of Barry Humphries, who was probably one of the most well-known of Australia's larrikins.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're the same or they had the same gravitas by any means, but I found some analogy to be drawn with the death of the Queen. And by that I mean, in the UK, I think a lot of the people were upset, not just because of the death of the Queen as a person, because they felt that some values that the Queen embodied were going with her. You know, quiet, dignity, stoicism, duty. These all felt like she was the last great person that embodied those things. And I felt somewhat similar when Barry Humphries passed away, because I felt like he embodied some of the Australian values that are now fading as well. And, you know, we mentioned larrikinism and irreverence and a rejection of political correctness, which we would now call wokeness. So my feeling initially was this was almost kind of it could be a line in the sand moment for Australia to say, are the Barry Humphries of this world the people that we want to put up on a pedestal in the future? I think they very much should be. Or is he going to be the last of a dying breed of people? And what replaces that is an interesting question, and it's potentially a very scary question.
Well, I think it's worth weighing into some of the fallout. So a while back, Barry obviously had a lot to do with the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, helped put it on the map, and he had an award named after him for 19 years. He made some comments that about transgenderism being a fashion and some other things like that. I think you can imagine what they would be. If not, go and check them out. And the award was the name was changed of the award to the Melbourne International Comedy Award or something like that. For a bunch of creative people, that's quite staggering to just default to that rather corporate title. But then just most recently, we've had, you know, he's passing in the final days of the festival. The festival had a moment to actually, they could have really run with it. Instead, I'm to understand they sort of dropped the ball and have done all sorts of things. There's been interviews with the festival organisers. They've denied that they cancelled him. So they've said, "Oh, we never cancelled him. We never can." I read those articles. And it was basically, we never cancelled him, and if we did, it was warranted. And then we've had comedians like Sammy J, a millennial comedian, write a sort of an apology for trying to get a middle ground between the two. I don't know if you read that article yesterday. Amazing piece, really, on many levels. But what's your reaction to this? Because I think this is a fascinating meta narrative for a lot of the stuff we've been talking about.
Obviously, totally spineless on the part of the comedy festival, which almost goes without saying. I reflect on just kind of how comedy has changed. And, in some respects, I think they're probably pandering to most of their, well, if not most of their audience, to most of the comedians that would now be at that festival. So I think the reason that they were so spineless and didn't put out an immediate tribute to Barry Humphries was because they would have been afraid that most of the comedians that were going to be performing on the final night of that festival would have boycotted, and many of them probably would have. I spoke to Konstantin Kissin and Francis Foster on Australiana, and they both basically said when they were on the comedy circuit full time before Trigonometry, if they were saying the types of things they're now saying on their podcast, no one in London would have given them a gig. Absolutely no one. In order to be a stand-up comedian now in Sydney, in London, in New York, you either have to play the Hannah Gadsby card and just do the whole identity politics humor and, oh my God, how terrible are white men, and, how tough is it to be gay or to be black or whatever. Or alternatively, you just have to go pure observational comedy and talk about, how annoying kind of airline food is. There is no place to challenge norms, and the great norm of our time is now the woke agenda. And it's terrifying because comedy was traditionally the art form that challenged and subverted kind of the societal norms. It was the thing basically that you relied on to call out the bullshit that you put up with in all other elements of your daily life. It gave you that safe space to laugh at the bullshit that you normally tolerate at work, that you normally tolerate from the mainstream media. And now we've lost that in comedy, and there isn't really another art form that replaces it. I think it's really, really sad, because I think there isn't really an important role for political satire and for comedy to call out the bullshit. And I don't think there's many people doing that now.
Well, there are a few comedians out there that do this, and Dave Chappelle is one of them. And I saw him play at Rod Laver Arena when he was in Australia a few months ago. Do you think that sort of on-edge comedy, is that now only reserved for huge names that can't be cancelled?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. The term uncancelable was in my mind as well. And the short answer is yes. I'm trying to think of an example of a right-wing comedian with who isn't uncancelable, who has a viable career. There may be a few, but really it's almost impossible, because you don't get the platform. You don't get the comedy show administrators. I think it's probably a cooler word than administrator they'd like to use, but that's the one that comes to mind. Who give you gigs. And again, I think it's really sad. I think it's why it's really important for the Chappelles of this world, for like the trigonometry guys, to be doing what they're doing. And the other thing I would maybe add as well is that there are a couple of, I guess what you say is traditional lefty comedians who are actually now starting to go, you know what? Some of the stuff, some of the institutional capture from this new left is wrong. You know, Bill Maher is the card-carrying example here. 20 years ago, he was the biggest lefty you'll ever meet, but he was the lefty in the traditional sense of high taxes, you know, expanded role of the state, help people out, you know, and he's kind of gone, well, that's not the left today. The left today is a woke agenda, which I certainly don't agree with. In fact, I think it's ridiculous. And he's actually had, and again, I think to your point, he has a big enough platform that he can afford to get away with that. But I think we probably need more of that traditional centre left to go, you know what, I agree, you know, in the traditional tenets of the left, but I don't agree with what it's turned into. And unfortunately, I think it's difficult to do that these days, because politics is increasingly becoming a sport where you just support your team, as opposed to saying, well, I like these bits about my team and I don't like these bits.
I don't know if you read this article I mentioned by this comedian, Sammy J, but it was basically, he said that he'd won a Barry Award and that he owed a lot to Barry, but he was also on the board when they renamed the award. And he basically, his main thesis seemed to be that the festival changed the award to service the artists because they were, you know, offended. He had a lot of talking points about, you know, how a trans person would feel, this archetypal trans person who's just, you know, suffering in silence while everyone's, I don't know, putting a jackboot on their knee, on their neck or whatever. And so he made some big claims in there. He said that, I'm sure some of you reading this might agree with what Barry said, but I'm guessing that most people who would think say the sorts of things that Barry said would be over a certain age, and that everyone who you know essentially agreed with the trans activist agenda or whatever would be under a certain age. He's drawn a line in the sand of a generational change there. Do you think that there's any credence to that?
I think there's a generational element, but I still think the vast majority of people under the age of 40 have that common sense view of gender and on the trans debate. I think the vast majority of people under the age of 40 still go, you know what, I don't particularly want a biological man in kind of a women's locker room, particularly if there are young girls around. I think that'd be 95% of people under the age of 40. So, and I think it's probably 99% of people over the age of 40. So I think it's there, but I think it's less so. You know, the fact of the matter is, and you guys would have spoken about this with Kelly J. Keane when you spoke to her, all of this stuff around the trans debate was stuff which we all were in societal wide agreement about only 10 years ago. And a very small minority have allowed us to capture the institutions that put out all of the sound and the noise to make it almost feel like there is more support for these quite fringe positions than what they are. And if I can draw a link to another conversation we had on Australiana with a guy called Peter Klein. Peter is an US academic who wrote a fascinating paper called Why Companies Go Woke. which got kind of global attention in business sections last year. And his argument is there isn't a groundswell for these sorts of woke policies in companies. 95% of people aren't all jumping up in unison to put pride flags up around the office. What it is if you think about a company in terms of 3 layers, very generally, the C-suite at the top, frontline at the bottom, and middle management in the middle. It's not the top that's driving this sort of cultural shift. CEOs are fundamentally responsible for shareholders and to the board. They're thinking about profit maximization most of the time. And most of the time as well, these are older, often white guys who probably, haven't been too closely following the culture wars. The front line isn't driving this because most of them just want to provide for their family, clock in, clock out. It's this glut of middle management in companies that are trying to make their jobs more purposeful than they otherwise would have been. The HR manager that doesn't want to just kind of fill in contracts anymore. They actually want to say that we are, making a more inclusive environment for our employees. Or the marketing manager who just doesn't want to flog Coke cans anymore. They want to, change the world by embracing or encouraging people to embrace diversity. And I think that same principle applies across both companies, but also in the media, maybe less so the media, but also across broader society. There is a group that is trying to increase their relative power in companies and in broader society. And in order to do that, they have microphones that can amplify the sound and therefore make it appear like more people actually support stuff which is very fringe than what is actually the case.
Do you think this is a sort of a growing trend where people are sort of making a paycheck, bringing home the bacon is not enough anymore? They need something more in their life to give themselves worth, and they want to change the world. They want to make the world better. And maybe there's not so much of a national mission anymore. Like there's nothing you can get behind in terms of your country, So I guess that battleground ends up being your work, where you can get more than just the paycheck.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Think about this. Not only is patriotism everywhere apart from the US, patriotism is now kind of passé. It's kind of almost, it's a bit cringe for a lot of people. So you're right. You lose that as a kind of organising principle around which you shape your value system. Religion has declined dramatically in the vast majority of the West over the last 50 years. I'm not a religious person, but I can see how it provides an organising framework for how you want to live your life and for the values you want to have. So what I think is if you take away country, if you take away religion, there's this vacuum, right? And I think this vacuum is now being replaced with some really bizarre, weird things. And I must say, and this is something we've talked about a lot on Australiana, I think the right, I think there are 2 groups to blame, the right and the left. The left is to blame because they've filled this vacuum with, I think, what is really harmful ideologies in the form of the series of woke ideologies that we've been talking about. But the right is to blame as well, because I don't think the right has done enough to say this is an alternative framework for the values that you should be thinking about in terms of how do you live your life. If I'm a 20-year-old bloke at the moment and I am hearing in some corners that you should be chivalrous and manly, and I'm hearing about toxic masculinity on the other side of the coin, if I'm seeing all this woke stuff, but I'm also hearing kind of people like me saying, this woke stuff is nonsense, I'd be bloody confused, to be honest. If I'm a young bloke at the moment, I don't really have an organising framework for how I want to live my life in absence of religion or nationalism or whatever. So I think more needs to be done from sensible centre-right people to say, these are not this is how you should think, but these are some kind of ways you should think about organising your values. Because in absence of providing a positive vision like that, all the negative stuff of wokeism, which admittedly brands itself very well, warm and fuzzy feelings and all that, is very appealing to a young person. And until we give them a better alternative, they're going to keep lapping up this rubbish.
For sure. Well, I think one of the other aspects is maybe that it's so hard now for young people to aspire to that more traditional life of owning a house and having a family. I mean, that's one of the things too, particularly in the US. Like, unless you're fortunate enough to go to a big university or to land sort of a big career, it's becoming almost impossible to get a foothold in the housing market. I mean, do you think that plays a part as well?
I think it plays a massive part, and not just, I think, for young people. I think there's a bigger point here in that I think in many respects life is easier than it was 100 years ago, but I think people feel like as well it's harder, and in some respects it is harder. So a fact that I like to return to, which I think says more about the US and politics in the US than any other, is that there is only one demographic in the US where life expectancy is actually decreasing year on year, and it has done for the last, I think, 10 or so years, and that is non-college educated white men. Now, if you think about it like that, suddenly someone like a Donald Trump makes a lot more sense, because you're going, bloody hell, I'm living in the Appalachian Hills and, don't have access to a healthcare education. Chances are I'm going to die younger than my father did. Of course you're going to be disenfranchised. Of course you're going to be angry, and you're going to start looking for solutions in really, really troubling places. Now, again, cost of living is probably is along the same lines there, if not quite as intense an emotion. But if you're a young person in Australia going, my parents relatively easily bought their first home, it's now almost an impossible dream for me, that leads to disenchantment. And I think you just got so many groups now that are going, this is perhaps the first time in human history where it's going to be harder for me to live my life than it was for my parents in modern history. And that leads to people lashing out, and it leads to people looking for solutions in bad places. And I think that's something which we are now seeing the outcomes of in Australia, in the UK, and in the US.
Let's talk about your political background, Will. Were you always interested in politics, or are you a bit like us in that politics and the culture wars have sort of hit you in the face?
I've always been interested in it, but my views on the importance of politics have changed. So I initially thought that kind of, probably when I was younger, aspired to be a political leader or to run the country. Now I couldn't think of anything worse. But more than that, I think that the power of politicians and the power of our leaders is just much less than what I initially thought, which is why I don't get too phased about Liberal or Labor in Australia, for example, because I don't think anything really substantially changes. I think across the Western world, we now have just this sort of glut of administrative bureaucracy that sits beneath the elected leadership layer that almost effectively runs the world. And I'm not going into kind of conspiracy theory stuff. It's just bureaucracy and the administrative layer of governance basically just ticks over regardless of government. There was
Yes, Minister.
Yes, Minister. Yeah, it was an analogy that someone said, which I've forgotten who it was, but they basically said, think of politics as the storm above the water on an ocean, and underneath, think of the administrative bureaucracy as the coral and as the fish that are swimming around in the reef. And if there's a storm going on above you, you kind of feel the water gently move from side to side if you're that fish. But really, you keep swimming along and the world keeps going. And I think that's kind of how I see politics in most Western countries. Maybe to a slightly lesser degree in the US, but particularly in Australia. Look at the last 20 years. Has a substantial life-changing reform really been introduced? I think the last one was probably the GST, if you think it really hard reform that most people didn't want initially, but then you had to sell. NDIS, you could make that argument, but really everyone wanted it, and it was just another way to shell out more money. Big reform is now next to impossible in Australia, and so as a result of that, politicians just tinker around the edges. So for me, I kind of go, I think the culture war stuff is more important because that is stuff which actually impacts the day-to-day lives of people and impacts our basic freedoms. But in terms of the politics that sit kind of at our executive layer, for me, it is just less and less important because I don't see change happening for the better through them. And really, I don't see them having enough power to do things that are terribly dangerous either.
Well, you mentioned the West. Let's talk about the West for a second. It said that there was a great awakening a few years ago, and I suppose we could say roughly that this means a shift towards radical social justice and or a focus on contested ideas of diversity and inclusion in the major institutions, government departments, for-profit companies, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, music, journalism, everywhere. But overnight, it seemed that everyone was suddenly convinced that we were now all living in the antebellum South. And we'd like to know your personal experience with this shift. You know, where were you when you heard the shot? You know, did you have you felt this coming? Did it happen at once? What do you think?
I noticed it most acutely, or perhaps it really slapped me in the face when I was living in New York and I was single at the time and I was having a whale of the time on the various dating apps. And Hinge was the go-to dating app at the time. And I remember looking and swiping and swiping and swiping. And I would say every fourth or every fifth profile that you would swipe through in New York had something like, if you are a conservative, don't bother swiping right. Or if you support Donald Trump, you disgust me, don't bother swiping right. And I reflected on this and I went, there was a time in human history, and I think probably our parents' generation, where you could not just be civil, you could be friendly, you could love people who have fundamentally different views to you. And just by looking at these profiles and these people going, you know what, I have no interest in understanding you as a human if you have different beliefs to me. I just went, that's such an interesting insight into the way that we think now. And I think it's a very sad insight. Even I think when I was younger in my teens, there was an enjoyment that came out of debating people who were different to you. I was a big debater at school. I loved it. I was one of those nerdy debating kids. And that was such a thrill to be able to kind of discuss those different ideas. And now I think we just have this mentality of, if you have a different belief structure, you're not just different to me, you're a bad person. And I think that's just such a corrosive thing that's happened in society. And I now see it more and more. But that moment on Hinge where I just went, you know what, there's no chance that we could ever be in a relationship because you just believe in lower taxes or you believe in a different set of political beliefs. That kind of hit home to me that the world has changed, and it's changed for the worse.
Well, I think that highlights the importance of long form media like podcasts, like what we're trying to do, where we actually talk to people and we tease things out. You don't really get that on mainstream media, where you have 3 minutes with a host on a Today Show somewhere. Do you think that alternative media will sort of pull us back to the centre?
Not easily. I agree with you in principle that it is a really good thing, but I wonder. The sad reality is that hopefully both of our podcasts will get to a point where we can influence the masses, but neither of us are quite there yet. And indeed, unless you're Joe Rogan, that's the case for almost everyone. So I think obviously it's still very much kind of non-traditional media is not mainstream for almost by definition. But I think the other thing I'm not a scientist, far from it, but I just think about how my brain has changed, I think, over the last 20 years. And I think a lot of people would say the same. I remember as a kid, as an 8 or 9 year old, staying up for hours reading a book. And I try sporadically to get back into reading. And after 5 minutes, I'm picking up my phone. And this is something which, I could do 4 hours as an 8-year-old. Something, I don't know the science, but something has happened to the way that our attention spans. And unfortunately, that means that people are less likely to engage in longer form media, like longer articles. Podcasts are a bit different because you can almost kind of half listen to them as you're doing something else. And I guess that also means you're not fully engaging with the ideas. But I think it'll be very hard for this to turn around, because I think there is a neurological thing going on here as well as a cultural thing, and that's something which probably can be teased out with far smarter people than me, but it is troubling.
Well, I feel like we wouldn't be doing our show if the ABC were doing their jobs. There's just no way they would platform the guests. You're interviewing, for instance, Posey Parker, Sydney Watson, Peter Klein, the list goes on. There are a couple of exceptions. A keen-minded people would say, well, Gigi Foster has been on the ABC, but she certainly wasn't allowed to do the kind of monologuing that a left activist or a slam poet on Q&A, would be able to do. People want to hear robust discussions about thorny topics. I mean, that we certainly do, and that's why. But we started with doing what we do. So why won't the ABC give us what we want?
Because 80% of journalists are left-leaning by almost by definition. Is the very simple answer. I think we can actually kind of go into conspiracy theory territory when we start thinking about why the media is overwhelmingly supporting kind of one side or one narrative, or why the the arts more generally, perhaps, is overwhelmingly kind of left leaning. Going back to our comedy discussion before, I actually don't think it's that it is a conspiracy. I think it is just these are industries, the creative industries, the media industries, attract generally more left-leaning people. And if you want to make money, which is associated more so with the capitalist right, you'll go and become a banker or a lawyer. You won't go and become an ABC journalist. So I think I don't think there's any conspiracy theory to it. I think it just means that probably if you went into the ABC newsroom, 80 to 90% of them would all vote the same way. Now, obviously, that's going to mean that when it comes time to produce shows, there's going to be an ideological bias. The problem is that if you're Sky News and you got a bias in the other direction, they're a private company, they're a company. They can do what they want. The ABC, as almost all of our listeners would know, has a charter that obligates them to be fair and to be independent. And unfortunately, they're just not meeting their charter. And I would add, in addition, I think in part, like they're trying to kind of create this centre-left identity or left identity, because it's harder and harder to justify having a publicly funded national news and entertainment network in 2023 when people can get their entertainment from Netflix and they can get their news from any number of a million different sources. In the 1950s, there was still a justification for that. There's no justification for having a publicly funded national news and entertainment broadcaster in 2023. So perhaps they're trying to say, well, look, fair and balanced and independent news isn't going to sell, and it's not going to make us relevant. In order for us to be relevant, we need to have Stan Grant on Q&A, spouting off on whatever it is he wants to spout off on. So I think there's part of that as well, that they're trying to justify themselves in a market where they probably don't have a role anymore.
I think also, like, if you looked 50 or 60 or 70 years ago and you looked at the people that worked at the ABC, none of those people would have university degrees. Whereas now, if you're a journalist, you've gone to university. And, I would like to see some industries, and I've mentioned this before to people on the podcast, I'd like some industries like journalism to go back to more of an apprenticeship deal where you might be 18, 19 and you shadow someone, you start in the mailroom, you work your way up. That sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, how can we get universities out of the picture a bit?
It's a good question. Yeah, sure. I absolutely agree with it. The problem is, I think, successive governments in Australia, again, probably this is a broader trend, have made university out to be the kind of be-all, end-all goal if you're a student. And somehow if you choose a trade, for example, or an apprenticeship, that is a lesser option. Now, it's patently ridiculous. I'm still paying off bucket loads of money from a law degree I'll never use, and there are plenty of people who would have gone straight in to become a plumber who are in an infinitely better financial position overall than I am now. So I think there is a branding problem for higher education, and that it's just people who should not be doing degrees go to university and get a useless arts degree or a useless law degree, as the case may be. And I think that branding has been in part generated from our parents and grandparents' generation, who believed genuinely that it was that sort of kind of that thing to aspire to, but they haven't realised that now everyone has a degree. It's less valuable, and it's also been propagated by successive governments who have tried to push more and more students through to the tertiary sector, and it's been pushed by the universities themselves, who have continuously dropped entry requirements. So people who shouldn't be doing particular degrees are now getting to do those degrees, all in the name of trying to make money. And you add all those things together, and you can see why someone who probably should be doing an apprenticeship as a carpenter is instead going and doing a commerce degree at UNSW or something like that.
Do you think that just to put a cap on the ABC? Do you think that the ABC has a class problem? So I spoke to a producer not too long ago, and they had to do some, I don't know, like a diversity statement or something like that about some project they were working on. I'm pretty sure it was for the ABC. And my suggestion to them was that in their diversity statement, they should say, well, we want to hire people, we want to focus on class. So we want to, everyone, I always tell them, I say, look, why don't you just go into that room and say, okay, everyone put your hand up. Who went to university? And when all the hands go up, say, all right, I need 60% of you or whatever to get out of the room right now. or I need, did you grow up on a coastal city? Okay, great. I need you to leave the room right now. You are fired. You are not working on this show at all. Now, obviously, this person hated everything I had to say. They looked at me like I was essentially the Q shaman. And so, but what's your view on this sort of unspoken or rather forgotten issue of class when we talk about the left and the ABC and the like?
Yeah, it's because the word diversity has been hijacked to mean demographics diversity as opposed to diversity of thought, or in some respects diversity of experiences. Now, diversity of experiences is different to racial diversity, because not all black people have had the same experience. You can't tell me that a young black person who went to an Ivy League school is going to be in a better position, for example, than someone with kind of white parents who were drug addicts who grew up in the Appalachian Mountains. It's just not the case. But to your point, institutions like the ABC, the only way they think about diversity now is through diversity of demographics, race, gender, sexuality. And the irony of this the great irony is that their push for diversity in the way that they see it is driving homogeneity. It's driving one worldview. It's driving one way of thinking. It's something I think about a lot. It's the most perverse contradiction in that by getting people who buy into this sort of identity politics narrative, you may very well get 50% men and 50% women and hit your gender quota. You may very well get a mix of religions. You may very well get a mix of races, but you're overwhelmingly going to get people that think the same way. Now, the way that I think about those sorts of targets, I'm generally not in favour of them. But if they are going to be there, they are there because the assumption is that if you do come from a different cultural group or you do come from a different gender, you have a different worldview as a result of that. And therefore, that should create diversity of thought. I see it as an input into creating diversity of thought, not an end in of itself. Now, it's obviously not creating that at the moment, and you can see the way that the ABC reports on things as the classic example, but you can extend this out to educational institutions, to the media, to businesses. It's rampant everywhere. And I think until we start thinking about diversity in the way that we should be thinking about it, we're going to keep getting kind of homogenous institutions that all think the same way and do the same things.
Well, we'd like to talk to you about The Voice, perhaps in part because you hit this thing a lot on Twitter. Unlike a lot of people, actually, you're actually one of the few public figures who are speaking about it. But perhaps we need to talking about The Voice first, because we've had some trouble getting people to talk about The Voice on the podcast. We had a hugely qualified, reputable person who we respect enormously. They had to pull out of appearing on the show after talking with the people they work with for various reasons. So we've had referendums before, but this feels different. What is it about this debate that is so radioactive, even to talk about?
A few things. So I did a little Wikipedia scan a couple of days ago on the history of referendums in Australia. I don't recommend any listeners do it. It's an incredibly dry read. But that's kind of the point. If you look at the referendums in the early 1900s, my God, they're boring. It's about kind of, the driest parts of the Australian Constitution. The two sexiest referenda that we've had are the last two, a republic and then now The Voice, because they're kind of those big ticket social or issues that align with kind of broader cultural narratives and social narratives. So I think that's the first thing. This is inherently a more divisive topic than the vast majority of referenda that have gone before the Australian people. The second thing is, and this is why I imagine you're struggling to get people on to talk about it, there is this awful, awful insinuation that if you don't believe in a change to our constitution and you plan on voting no, you must be racist. Now, this is something which I have just it has saddened me, and it has made me incredibly angry. There are plenty of very prominent Indigenous leaders who are going to vote no. We've got Maura Mundine coming on Australiana. That's going to be out tomorrow for the shameless plug, who is obviously very heavily involved in the no campaign. You can be for indigenous people and against the voice. And I just don't think this is quite there yet. I think we will get there over the course of the campaign, where more people will have the courage to come out and say, you know what, I think that what is going on in remote indigenous communities is unacceptable. There are obviously problems we need to solve, but this is not the best way to do it. In fact, this is something which will be counterproductive, not just on a principled level, but it's counterproductive to indigenous outcomes. And I genuinely believe that this is wrong in principle, and I think it's wrong in practice as well.
Well, speaking of plugs, you wrote a great opinion piece recently about The Voice titled Australia's Misguided Voice. And I guess for the benefit of our international listeners, we should probably explain what The Voice is, which is basically it's a proposed body chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with the power to make representations to Parliament on various issues relating to those groups. And yeah, as you say, we will be voting on that sometime later this year. But you made the great observation about guilt and desperation being a bad mix in decision-making. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, so it's no coincidence that the vast majority of people who are advocating for The Voice are predominantly white. They're predominantly kind of in the elite institutions that we've hit on already. You know, they're in the ABC, they're in kind of the mainstream media, they're at kind of the in the corporate sector. These are people who I think, and you know, who struggle with the concept of white guilt, that things that happened in our past that we had nothing to do with, we need to atone for those things. Now, this is something which, again, is nothing. This isn't unique to Australia. For international guests, if you live in London right now, then you would have seen the same thing in how particular people try to come to terms with their colonial past. If you live in New York right now, you're seeing the same thing in terms of how people try to come to terms with slavery. This is our equivalent of those two subjects. My view is a very simple one, and it is, you know, we are not accountable for the things, for the acts of our ancestors. And it's as simple as that. Now, there is a separate conversation to be had around, is this a good thing for improving the here and now? And there are huge problems in the here and now, but I think we need to separate that from, well, bad things happened in the past, and this is a way to make good on some of those past injustices. And unfortunately, I would say most of the people, whether consciously or unconsciously, who are supporting this are doing it because they are guilty about what has happened in Australia's history. They ignore many of the wonderful things that have been part of Australia's history, and they think that this is a way to atone for that, when really, you know, we can't change, you know, what happened, you know, pre-1901 or indeed at any stage before today.
Well, it's hard to get behind this thing for many reasons, but one aspect that seems to be a big talking point on both sides is that there's a lack of detail about how this advisory body would work. Do you think that will ultimately sway the vote to no?
Yes, I do, and it certainly was one of the factors that crippled the Republic referendum in 20 years ago. And I think as well that the reason why there is a lack of detail is because if you do put the detail out there, it's pretty scary. Now, the big argument you will get from the yes side is that one of them is that this is just this body will only make representations. They will only put forward opinions to the executive branch on particular issues. When you dig a bit deeper, you realise that it goes beyond that. And there's two reasons why this goes beyond just being a representative body. The first is, and I'm not going to go into detail because it is fundamentally boring and I wanted to leave it as soon as I left law school, and it's administrative law. And that is basically that the government is accountable for the way in which they make decisions, for due process being followed. And if you have standing, that means that you can call out the government if they haven't followed due process. Not just the government, but the administrative bureaucracy. So at this stage, from what I can see, from all of the submissions I've read, the Voice will have the ability to make representations on anything from the line that's going around is submarines to interest or to taxation policy. Now, think about that a bit deeper. Number one, this will slow down the running of government because they're going to need to get detail from the executive branch well before that policy is actually announced. If they're going to make a representation, they need to have a say before that actually goes to the public. So before every substantial act of policy, perhaps any act of policy, you're going to have to then put a draft before this nebulous body and say, all right, give us a point of view. then you're going to have to hear their response and you're going to have this to and fro. I can't see how this doesn't just grind the wheels of governance almost to a halt. But then, even if you don't take that into account, every time that a government policy is made and it potentially doesn't, and the government doesn't want to take into account the representations of that particular body, there's going to be insinuations that they're racist. And unfortunately, we're already seeing like the debate at the moment is the perfect example of this. If you disagree with an indigenous point of view, you're a racist. Now, no government's going to want to risk that. So I think you're going to see, kind of pretty much every representation made by this group being adopted in some way, shape, or form. And I think the easier ones for government will go first. If I think if this gets through, there's no way that Australia Day is January 26th next year. Absolutely no way at all. But I think there are other kind of really easy things where, if you play that scenario out, that voice body, of course they will say, that is a matter of interest, and they will say, yes, it is the view of Indigenous people that the date changes. Play that out, and if the government was to say, no, we disagree with this newly elected body that we've just gone through a referendum to put in place, that they will be labelled either incompetent or they'll be labelled racist. No way they're going to say no to something like that. And you play that out for all of these major issues, and you can see that the idea that this is just representations may be right even in on the paper, but when it comes to political realities, it's just not.
I'm to understand that the voice is really just part one of a trilogy we didn't ask for. I don't know in which order this Justice League trilogy comes, but it's like voice, truth, treaty, or something, some kind of mixture of these things. I'm fascinated by this because, firstly, it sounds very long. And it sounds like an endless. This second one, truth, really fascinates me. Particularly in light of what we now know is the truth of many people, of many of the activists at outfits like the ABC and on the left side of politics, my truth, subjective truth. So what's your view on this entire sort of struggle session trilogy that we're looking down the barrel of?
Well, there's no end goal, right? We can't just say, oh, well, the way you've framed it is almost like it's step 1, step 2, step 3, but there will never be people who will be satisfied that their truth is being recognised or observed. So the idea that, that this is a linear process is wrong. This is something that will just go on and on and on. And you'll always have people who will be perpetual victims. So I think that's concerning. And the thing that really annoys me is that this is painting a picture of Australia that says that we are inherently systemically racist, or that there is this division between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. And it's just not the case. We are overwhelmingly a kind-hearted people. We are not a racist country. The fact that we have problems in remote Indigenous communities is a separate conversation to that. But by insinuating that we need to get all of this on the table, that we need to deal with intergenerational trauma, that we need to, we need to almost atone for these sins. It's this black armband view of history which keeps telling us to be negative about who we are. Now, we talked earlier in the podcast about Australia's identity crisis at the moment, and I think this only makes it worse because, for example, there are a lot of people who now just say if you've got a Australian flag on your Twitter feed or on your Twitter handle, you're a racist. Patriotism is almost seen as being kind of a bit extreme far right, and I think this whole narrative just adds to that, as opposed to saying stop treating Aboriginal people differently. And this, I'm quoting Warren Mundine from this podcast coming out tomorrow. Stop treating them differently and say we are all Australians, and deal with problems on the basis of need, not because some people with a certain skin colour happen to have that problem. That's why I think that this whole voice issue, not only are you not a racist if you choose to vote no, I think you fundamentally believe in the concept of equality before the law, the most anti-racist position you can take.
As a side note, there's a guy that lives a couple of blocks away from me who has an Australian flag and a flagpole, and he's had to go so far as to set up 2 security cameras around this thing, and he's even got a plaque kind of explaining why he has that out there. I think he's an Irish immigrant, and he used to be in the army, and he loves Australia, he loves democracy. But I always walk past this thing, and I think it's so sad that guy had to go that far just for the Australian flag, you know.
Extraordinary.
Now, yeah, it's crazy. And you mentioned, you know, what the end goal is. And I think the end goal should be trying to fix what's happening out there in regional towns and remote communities like Alice Springs, because what's happening out there is horrific. And, you know, especially on a domestic abuse front with high numbers of domestic violence and child sexual abuse being cited. It seems like the right decision in many cases would be to remove children from those situations and find appropriate care for them. But governments won't do this because they don't want to be accused of being part of a second stolen generation. Now, if the tables were turned and there was abuse happening to white children, which no doubt there is in some unfortunate places, they would be rescued from those situations and no one would question this. Like, how do we have this conversation and how do we separate the historic stolen generation from modern child welfare policies?
Courage. Courage is the short answer, because you are going to have people who will say that it is racist to do that, and it's wrong, but you need to have courage to be able to, in a sensible way, push back. If I pull out again, I think I'm always interested in what's kind of going on in other parts of the world, and I think it's a risk to look at the voice and some of these things in Australia in isolation, because if you take the example just there, the exact same thing's going on in the UK with the grooming gang scandal in the UK, where over the last 20, 30 years, thousands of young girls have been raped in primarily Pakistani ethnic minority groups, and almost no one's been prosecuted. The issue hasn't gotten almost any attention, a bit more now, but next to no attention in the media, because people are afraid of being labelled racist. And there's also some people who try and excuse this on cultural grounds and saying that, well, it's just a matter of cultural difference. Same thing in Australia. There are too many people who are afraid to have difficult conversations about race because of their fear of being labelled racist. There isn't an easy answer in my view, other than in a really sensible, clear way, saying that these are the facts and we need to act on those facts. Now, again, unfortunately, the world in which we live doesn't lend itself to nuanced, common sense debate, and so it's a really hard thing to do.
Do you think, Will, that, because I think we were talking to Anthony Dillon about this, and I asked him about how get his crystal ball out, and if he thought that because people don't understand the detail of this of the voice or the proposal, that they'll just go in and vote no. And he said, well, no, actually, quite the opposite. He feels that because they don't know the detail, they'll go on emotion and go in and just vote yes. Don't you? I mean, look, I've been staggeringly wrong about our politics for years now. So much so that I gotten everything wrong. Like for years, like, you know, I thought Bill Shorten was going to win. Like, you know, I've got a terrible record. I've just got this sinking feeling that everyone is going to go into that booth and say, I'm not racist. Yes.
Yeah, I mentioned this to Warren Mundine, and he responded that that's not a concern of his. And the reason is the great Australian invention of the secret ballot. So you can be spat at outside the polling booth. You can be called a racist. When you get in there, no one knows how you're going to vote. And once again, we have historical precedent here, recent historical precedent, and that's the Trump effect, where one of the reasons why the polls got Trump so wrong was because a lot of people were a bit concerned to tell a pollster on the phone, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. But as soon as they got into the polling booth, that changed very quickly. So my instinct is, if the polls are even within 5 or 6 points to the yes side come election day, I think that will switch in the polling booth, because you will get that silent vote of people who are uncomfortable saying they're going to vote no in public, but then in the privacy of the polling booth, they will turn. So I think the yes vote needs to be significantly out ahead in the polls come election day for this to get through. And if you look at the polling and the trend, like when Albanese first announced it, there was something like 80% popular support. That's now going down into the 60s. if you look at the polling at the same stage of pretty much every modern referendum, when I say modern over the last 40 years, this is a terminal trend. I'm not going to be responsible for people losing their money. Obviously, I'm choosing to vote no, but I also very strongly believe it will be a no vote because I don't think the public support is where it needs to be at this stage of the campaign for it to pass what is a really hard bar of a double majority. I think there will be a bit of that, but at the same time, I think that will be counteracted by the fact that we are going to see a lot of silent no voters.
Well, I don't know how you feel about this, Will, but I find referendums very tedious. I feel like all we've talked about for months is the voice. And I was thinking, do we need some sort of formal event? I'm thinking like an Oxford debate where each side puts together a crack team of debaters. We do the debate, then we all go and vote. We're done with it. How does that sound?
I think it'd be a great idea. Unfortunately, I don't think it'll stop the attention. This is the other thing with this referendum is I just kind of go, and don't for a second take this as me not saying Indigenous issues are important, but this particular way that we're choosing to address it, in the greater scheme of things, I can think of 100 things that I would rather have a referendum on tomorrow. And I think this is something which can very easily be legislated. You're right. This sucks up every ounce of political oxygen for a whole year. This is all of Albanese's political capital. If this doesn't go through, then no substantial reform happens for the rest of Albanese's first term because he's already sucked out all of the goodwill from trying to get a voice over the line. And I just kind of go, this is a country that has systemic problems that we need to address, both within Indigenous affairs and more broadly. Why are we doing it on a body which no one has been able to establish will lead to better outcomes for Indigenous people? Not a shred of evidence. I always put it to people on Twitter, show me the links in a causal chain between Indigenous kids not going to school or Indigenous women getting raped and a voice and that happening less. And no one can just say step 1, step 2, step 3. They say, oh, well, if you give them a say in their own affairs, that will lead to better outcomes. I'm sorry, that's not a high enough bar to change our constitution. It's this kind of vague waffle. And until I hear someone actually really clearly lay out, this will mean that the hideous rates of sexual assault in Indigenous communities goes down, or until I hear that more Indigenous kids are going to go to school through this, then there's no reason in my mind to go through this whole process.
Will, not to circle back to the ABC, although I could bash them all day. I heard a report the other day. Like it was actually a good piece of reporting. It was about HEX, so you should listen to that since you have still a HEX debt, I'm assuming. It was good reporting, but the report began with, I'm so-and-so from, this is so-and-so reporting from Gadigal lands. And then she went into her story, which had nothing to do with anything. Now, a few things for there. I was sitting there going, is she in Sydney? Do you mean you're in Sydney? What is that what you mean? Like, why are you saying, like, I actually don't know what, because it wasn't an Indigenous story, an article or anything like that. She was just letting you know at the beginning of this little report. So, what do you think of the acknowledgement to country in difference to the, and the welcome to country, I suppose? And do you think that this is going to play any role in the referendum?
Potentially, tangentially, perhaps. So I've got a theory. I'm convinced now that the editors at the Australian kind of are sipping whiskey of a night, maybe with cigars, and they're kind of chortling themselves, going, "How can we take the piss without really looking like we're taking the piss?" And the recent interview with Marsha Langton, where the title was something like "Vote No, and you will never get another welcome to country in Australia." It just went viral on Twitter because everyone was going, "You bloody beauty."
Yes.
And that's probably how 80% of people think in Australia. They go, you know what? We agree that there are problems with Indigenous people currently. We acknowledge that the heritage they have. But the fact that we have to go through this virtue signalling bullshit ritual at the start of every meeting, before every kickoff, across before every Anzac Day service, that's just beyond the pale. Because Australians are I think, quite pragmatic, practical people, and I think they realise that this is completely and totally meaningless because it doesn't come with practical action attached to it. You know, if you're going to do the whole welcome to country, then by extension, that means that that particular business should be, if not giving up the lease for the offices and handing it back over to Indigenous people, at the very least doing a heck of a lot more than most companies currently are. But it's, you know, it's entirely a virtue signaling exercise. And I think, you know, the problem is a lot of, if I was to come out and say, you know, I don't like welcome to country rituals, then instinctively so many people who disagree with me will go, oh, you horrible racist. And I'm not. And most people aren't. They're just people who hate virtue signaling at the expense of real, tangible action. And unfortunately, Indigenous affairs is the classic example, with the apology being, you know, the start of this, or maybe a good example of this, of politicians just being really comfortable promoting symbols as opposed to getting their hands dirty because it's harder, because it's sometimes uncomfortable, because it requires really difficult policies. And so I think there is an element of that in this voice debate as well. This is a warm and fuzzy thing. It's not really getting down and dirty and solving tough problems in Indigenous communities.
Well, speaking of virtue signalling, my wife drew my attention to this. She recently went to Australia Post. She had to get some sort of parcel to deliver something. And on the back there, where you can write the address of where you're sending this parcel, there is a section where you can put the traditional place name of wherever you're sending this thing. So, you know, I just wonder, you know, 1 Wurundjeri Street, Wurundjeri land. I mean, people don't use these sorts of place names in this sort of context. It has no practical sort of solution. Do you have any thoughts on just how insane some of this virtue signalling is?
Of course it is. The thing is, if you're a person and you want to refer to where you live that way, go ahead. I couldn't care less. But it's the way that it has been weaponized to fit particular political agendas, and the way that it's been weaponized for companies to brand themselves is what I have a problem with. And I think you can say the same thing about LGBTQ plus whatever. Most companies are doing this because other companies do it. Great example, which most people would have seen, is whenever Pride Day, Pride Month rolls around, you get those memes where you see the way that companies have changed their logos for their Facebook page in the West, and they haven't changed their logo for Facebook pages in the Middle East. And it goes to show, well, your principles aren't kind of contingent on where you are. You either have principles or you don't. And I think kind of most people, even if they're too afraid to say it out loud, see that when they see kind of things like, you know, I live on Camaragal country, because, you know, you're not actually really investing in tangible change. And if I could add, you know, Tony Abbott is a really prominent voice in the No campaign. And you know, and he's someone who would call out this sort of virtue signaling stuff. And a lot of people would just go, oh, it's Tony Abbott, why should we have to listen to him? Or it's just a white guy, why should we have to listen to him? This is someone who for the last 20 odd years has gone out and lived in remote Indigenous communities for a week or a couple of weeks. He has seen remote Indigenous communities and spent more time there than any other non-Indigenous politician of the last 20 years, because he's actually interested in real change and actually getting his hands dirty and having a look. Now, unfortunately, that's not in vogue. You know, it's easier to change your social media profile. It's easier to do a welcome to country. It's really hard to go to an remote Indigenous community and reduce rates of alcoholism from X% to X%. Very, very tough. And most people can't be bothered to do it. So it's a way for them to still look like a good person without actually doing the tough stuff.
Well, we want to give you the final word, Will. We're mindful of your time. Both our podcasts talked about, we both talked to guests who say things that would get many of our listeners shunned or fired, as we've said. So just an open-ended question to you, what's your view on the speaking of uncomfortable truths today?
One of my favourite quotes came from I heard it from John Anderson initially, and he basically said the only cure for cancel culture is courage culture. And I think the great thing about what you guys are doing is I think kind of courage is, and this will sound like I'm kind of some D-grade Tony Robbins, but courage is a muscle, right? And I think the more that you exercise it, the more that you get better. And I think that's the same at a collective level. The more that you hear people just coming out and sensibly pushing back from really silly positions, the more it encourages other people to be courageous. Now, you don't have to do that. You don't have to point out uncomfortable truths by being hugely provocative. You don't have to be a dick about it. But you can just say, you know what, there is a narrative here which, to be honest, I don't believe in. These are the reasons I don't believe in it. You're free to believe what you want, but I'm not really going to go along with that. Not enough people at the moment are happy just to say what I think is a pretty normal, uncontroversial thing to say. So I think the more that people can think about this as an exercise in courage, the easier it will be for people who potentially at the moment are too afraid to speak up, too afraid to say what they believe to be able to do it. And so again, I'd say, what you guys are doing is fantastic, and please keep doing it, because I think it fills a really important role in society.
Well, one thing we do on this show is we're trying to encourage our audience and our listeners to read more. And one way we do that is by asking all of our guests what they are reading. So, Will, what are you reading right now?
I've just finished probably the best book I've read in about 5 years, called Say Nothing. And it's about the troubles in Northern Ireland. And it's just the most extraordinary book. And it's a part of history I knew nothing or next to nothing about. So if you want a gripping read, understand a really kind of turbulent time in history, but it's almost presented like a thriller, Say Nothing is a cracker.
Is that the same author who wrote the one on Big Pharma?
Yeah, and I've read that one as well. Patrick Radden Keefe.
Is that a good book?
He's brilliant. Yeah, fantastic. And talk about uncomfortable truths, the fentanyl crisis in the US, which is now somewhat more under control, but still a massive problem, is something which I don't think most Australians have a clear enough view of, because it's not as big a problem here, thank God. But yeah, scary stuff.
Absolutely going to check that out. Well, Will, everyone should listen to the Australiana podcast. Where can they listen to that, and where can they find you online?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is @Will Kingston, and the Australiana podcast is under Australiana, wherever you get your podcasts, to use that wonderful term. And yeah, it's we would love to have you as part of the Australiana community.
Also consider subscribing to The Spectator.
Yeah, thank you. Rowan Dean will be very happy to hear. Please subscribe to the Spectator Australia, $16.99 a month with 1 month free to boot. Best investment you'll ever make.
Very good. Well, thanks so much, Will. We've had a blast.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.